The hospital had 9 floors, and Yuna had learned to think of them the way a gambler thinks of chips, each one something she could spend, something she could lose, something she could never get back. She stood at the window on the 8th floor and watched the city burn. Varek had been a city of pale stone and wide canal streets, the kind of place that looked better in rain, and it had been raining the day the Dreth came. Now it was 19 days later, and the canals had gone the color of rust, and the pale stone was black in long streaks where the energy weapons had kissed it. She could see 4 distinct fires from where she stood. She had stopped trying to identify what was burning. Sergeant Delacroix. She didn't turn from the window. "Ma'am." Delacroix materialized at her shoulder. He had a gift for that, for being exactly where she needed him without being summoned. He was 32 and looked 50, which was approximately how Yuna felt. He had a deep gash along his left jaw that Reyes had closed with 6 stitches 4 days ago and which had gone slightly yellow at the edges in a way Yuna didn't like. 3rd floor position. What's the count? 14 Dreth confirmed dead in the east corridor since last rotation. Voss thinks there are another, for they haven't recovered. She's been watching the thermal signatures. Voss is always right about thermal signatures. Yes, ma'am. Which means they'll change the approach vector. Again. Yuna turned from the window. The 8th floor had been a pediatric ward once. She tried not to look at the drawings on the walls, children's drawings, crayon figures on cheap paper tacked at child height, because they made something happen behind her sternum that she didn't have time for. Pull Voss from 3rd and put her on the north stairwell. If they're rotating around, they'll come up through the maintenance corridor first to test it. That's a long exposure for her. I know. Pair her with Lek. Delacroix's expression shifted, not much, but Yuna read his face the way she read the building, every shift meaningful. Lek's been awake for 31 hours, Sergeant. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. There's no one else. He nodded. He left. That was the thing about Delacroix. He understood the arithmetic of the impossible, and he didn't make her explain it twice. Yuna walked the 8th floor. She did this every 2 hours, the full circuit, because it was the only way to know what was actually happening as opposed to what people reported was happening, and those two things were not always the same. The 8th floor was hers, command position. The civilians clustered here in the central ward where the structural columns gave them the best protection, the soldiers rotating through in pairs at every access point. She had 6 people here. She had 8 on the floors below, distributed with the geometry of desperation, 2 per choke point, enough to hold a position for 40 minutes but not enough to hold it forever. The civilians were another calculation entirely. She found Dr. Essa Omalade in the main ward, moving between patients with a particular efficiency of someone who had made peace with the absence of adequate supplies. Omalade was the ranking physician. She had been ranking physician since Dr. Mwangi died on day 11, which no one spoke of directly, which was a weight everyone carried. She was a small woman with close-cropped hair and extraordinarily precise hands, and she met Yuna's eyes with the calm of someone who had cried herself empty several days ago and was now operating in the territory beyond that. Analgesics, Omalade said, before Yuna could speak. I know. I have enough for 3 more days if I'm conservative. 2 if someone else comes in critical. I know, doctor. The children, Omalade stopped. The 3 with the respiratory complications. Without the filtration system running on full power, they'll deteriorate. Tell me what you need. A functioning power grid. The orbital blockade lifted. The war to stop. Omalade looked at her hands. I'll manage. I always manage. I just need you to understand what managing is costing. Yuna understood. She moved on. She passed Corporal Neka Pharaoh sitting against the corridor wall, rifle across her knees, eating something from a foil packet with the blank expression of someone eating purely for fuel. Pharaoh was 20, the youngest of them, and she had freckles across her dark skin that made her look younger still. She'd been a communications specialist before the siege cut all long-range transmissions. Now she was a riflewoman, and she had turned out to be an excellent one, which Yuna suspected Pharaoh found neither comforting nor satisfying. Anything from the antenna array? Yuna asked, though she already knew the answer. The Dreth are still jamming everything above short range. I got a fragment this morning. Might have been a fleet carrier signature, might have been interference. I can't tell. Pharaoh paused. I keep listening. Keep listening. She found Private Tomas Reyes, their medic, 26, perpetually ink-stained because he kept notes on his forearm when he ran out of paper, crouching over a supply inventory near the stairwell door. Reyes had a habit of humming under his breath while he worked, something tuneless and private, and he stopped when he heard her boots. "Still counting the same supplies," he said, "and still getting the same answers. The answers are what they are." "Yeah." He capped his pen. Looked up. He had very dark eyes and a way of looking at people directly that could be mistaken for challenge but was actually just attention. "Sergeant, I need to talk to you about Lek. When he comes off rotation." "Sleep." "I know. I'm sending Voss with him specifically so she'll watch him." "It's not just fatigue. He's—" Reyes hesitated. "He shakes. Between positions. He hides it, but I've seen it twice." Yuna absorbed this. Added it to the column of things that were true and could not be changed right now. "After the shift," she said. "Keep watching." She found Private, or at the end of the east corridor, sitting very still in the corner beside a blown-out wall panel, head slightly tilted, eyes not quite focused. He had a rifle in his hands, and his hands were easy and loose on it, not gripping, not tense, just there, the weapon as extension. He was 23. He was taller than anyone else in the unit by several inches, and he had the particular physical quality of someone made from two different blueprints, the human and Dreth genetics distributed in ways that weren't quite symmetrical. His eyes were pale, nearly colorless, with the secondary pupil of the Dreth, a vertical contraction that happened in bright light, and his bone structure was human enough that you could spend an hour with him before noticing the subtle ridge formations at the temple and jaw. He had joined the human military at 18, and Yuna had never asked him why directly, though she had heard enough to understand the outline. "Oh." He came back from wherever he'd been. Focused on her. "Sergeant, you're off rotation in 20. "Yes." "I want your read on the south approach before you sleep. They changed vectors twice in 24 hours, which means their sector commander is being flexible." "What does that tell you?" Or was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of his silences was something Yuna had come to pay attention to. They were not empty, they were working. "It tells you the sector commander is young," he said finally. "Dreth tactical doctrine at the senior level is rigid. You use the approach that conserves assets the best, and you use it until it stops working, and then you use the next most conservative approach. Changing twice means either the commander is improvising, which is unusual, or they've received new orders from above that are changing the objective parameters." What kind of orders could change the parameters? Timeline acceleration. He met her eyes. Something has changed externally. They need the building faster than they planned. Yuna felt the significance of that settle into her chest. She stored it. "Get some sleep after your read." "Yes, Sergeant." She moved on. She always moved on. That was the job. Move on, hold the next position, spend the next chip. The hospital had 9 floors. She had held 8 of them for 19 days. The first floor had fallen on day 6, which was early, which had cost them Specialist Andredas and Private Jew, Andredas who had been 38 and kept photographs of his twin daughters folded in his chest pocket, Jew who had been a 24-year-old from the mountain settlements and who had sung badly and frequently and whose absence had left the group quieter in a way that was structural, like a missing wall. The first floor was Dreth held now, and she did not think about Andredas and Jew except at night, when she couldn't help it, when the building breathed around her and the fires outside painted the ceiling in moving orange, and then she thought about them precisely and completely, and then she put them away and started again. 19 days. 31 soldiers, down from 41. 612 civilians. 9 floors become 8 become 7, and the math of survival running through every calculation she made, every order she gave, every face she looked at in the blue-gray light of the hospital's failing auxiliary power. The Dreth wanted the building intact. That was the only reason they were still alive. She knew it. She was grateful for it in the cold, pragmatic way she was grateful for anything, purely, without feeling, and she used it the way she used everything, as a tool, as a parameter. They would not shell. They would not use heavy ordnance. They were fighting room by room because they wanted the rooms, and that constraint was the edge she had been using to survive. 19 days. She went back to her position and started planning day 20. IT had started on day 2. Or hadn't understood what he was hearing at first. The building's interference patterns were complex. the Dreth jamming signal interacting with the hospital's own communication hardware in ways that produced audio artifacts in anything with a receiver, and there were receivers everywhere in a hospital, medical equipment and PA systems, and the emergency communication nodes that still flickered with residual function. Everyone heard the static. Everyone had learned to ignore it. Or had been sitting near a wall panel on the 3rd floor, trying to sleep, when the static resolved into something. Not words, exactly. Dreth command communication wasn't words in the human sense. It was a layered structure of tonal patterns that carried information the way music carried emotion, densely, simultaneously. He had learned it young, from his mother, who had been full Dreth and who had spoken to him in both languages until the day she couldn't speak anymore. He had not used it in 5 years. He had not wanted to. But he heard it, and he understood it, and what he understood was, second rotation advance on the eastern axis, hold the northern position, priority is structural integrity preservation. He lay very still. He thought about Private Jew, who was dead, who had been killed in the eastern access corridor on day 6. He thought about it for a long time, and then he got up and he went to Corporal Pharaoh, and he told her that he had a bad feeling about the eastern corridor, and she should mention to Sergeant Yuna that they might want to reinforce the position there. He did not say why. Pharaoh had given him a sideways look and said feelings weren't intelligence, or had said he knew that, but she'd passed it along, and Yuna had moved Specialist Chen to the position, and the Dreth advance had come up the eastern corridor 20 minutes later, and Chen had been ready for it. 11 Dreth dead. No human casualties. He had told himself it was a coincidence. He had told himself he'd been half asleep and half dreaming, and the signal had resolved into apparent meaning the way all static eventually resolved into apparent meaning if you listened long enough and desperately enough. He told himself this for 2 days. On day 4 he heard it again, clearly, with precise directional indicators and timing sequences, and he realized it wasn't going to stop. The Dreth jamming signal was carrying their command communications by accident, or possibly by design, as an encrypted layer they believed no human ears could parse. And was not fully human. And he could hear it. And he understood it. And every hour of every day it was telling him exactly where they were going to move and when. He hadn't told Yuna. He hadn't told her because he could see, very clearly, how the conversation would go. You've been listening to Dreth command signals. You understand them completely. You're half-Dreth. You've been passing intelligence without disclosing the source. And underneath that, the thing no one would say but everyone would think, whose side? Not because he was untrustworthy. He believed most of them trusted him. He believed Yuna trusted him specifically in the operational sense that mattered. But because the moment he disclosed what he was hearing and how he was hearing it, trust became a question instead of a baseline, and in a siege, questions killed people. Or possibly he was wrong about all of that. Possibly Yuna would simply nod and say good, keep listening. But he could not be certain, and certainty was everything in a 9-floor hospital with 31 soldiers and 600 lives in the balance, and so he kept the silence and he used the information and he told himself he would tell her when there was time, when it was safe, when the right moment arrived. The right moment kept not arriving. He developed a system. He didn't report the intelligence directly. He was careful about that, careful in the way that took real work, real restraint, because sometimes what he heard was time-critical and delivering it with enough indirection to seem like intuition rather than knowledge was genuinely difficult. He learned to frame things as tactical reads, pattern analysis, instinct. The South Corridor is going to pressure tonight. I can feel the shift in their approach. He learned to attach his intelligence to plausible reasoning. Their sector commander is changing vectors, timeline acceleration, which means they'll prioritize the maintenance shaft. The analysis was real. It was his actual read of what he heard, but the source was invisible. It worked. It worked 19 times out of 19, with the precision of something that was not intuition at all, and Yuna was starting to notice. She noticed it first on day 8. They had been holding the 4th floor, 2 positions, Pharaoh and Delacroix at the main corridor junction, Chen and Private Isaacs at the secondary stairwell. The Dreth had been probing the 4th for 2 days in a pattern that suggested they were trying to identify the position with the thinnest coverage before committing a full advance. Standard doctrine. Yuna had been watching the probe pattern and expecting them to hit the secondary stairwell, which was the most exposed. Or had said, quietly, not making a case for it, just saying it, they'll come through the service elevator shaft. They'll disable the elevator on 3 and come up through the maintenance access. Yuna had looked at him. The service elevator shaft was an unusual choice. It was a choke point, defensible for the attackers but also for the defenders, and it presented significant structural risk if anything went wrong. "That's a high-cost approach," she said. "They've identified our coverage pattern. They know the stairwells are defended. The shaft is the one approach we haven't put heavy coverage on because it's obviously a choke point." He paused. "They know we know it's a choke point. They're betting we've decided it's not worth defending because it limits them as much as it limits us." "And you think they're reversing that logic?" "Yes." She had studied him for a moment. Then she'd moved Isaacs to a crossfire position that covered the elevator shaft, left the secondary stairwell on light coverage, and waited. They came up through the shaft. Isaacs caught them in the crossfire. 6 dead, the advance broken. It was a good tactical read. It was the kind of read experienced soldiers made. Or had good instincts. She'd known that since Solstice, since before the siege began, and she had attributed it to that. But on day 11, Wenner told her they should pull the North Corridor fire team back 50 meters because the Dreth were going to attempt a thermal charge burn-through on the corridor junction, and they did, within the hour, in the exact location he'd indicated. She started to build a different model. She didn't share it with anyone. She filed it and watched. Day 13, or flagged a change in Dreth rotation timing that let them slip Lek and Voss through a gap in coverage to retrieve medical supplies from the second-floor storage before it was fully secured. He was right down to the minute. Day 14, or told her the East Quadrant Dreth advance was a feint and the actual push would come from the west in 40 minutes. Both things were exactly true. Day 15, she was standing in the corridor after a sustained 2-hour assault on the 5th floor. They'd held it, barely, with Faro taking a glancing burn across her left forearm and Reyes working in the middle of it, stitching and covering simultaneously, the way he always worked, and she was watching or at the far end of the corridor, and he was doing that thing again, the stillness, the slight tilt of the head, the eyes not focused on anything visible. She thought, he's listening to something. She thought, what is he listening to? She filed it again. There were 600 civilians in the hospital, and the 5th floor had just held, and the 4th was still holding, and she had 29 soldiers left, and 2 of them were carrying wounds that Reyes was watching closely, and there was no time. There was never any time. "Or," she said. He looked at her. "What do you need?" "Nothing, Sergeant." "What are you thinking about?" A pause. A fractional hesitation that she had learned to read as the space between the truth and the version of the truth he was going to give her. "I'm thinking about the timeline acceleration you mentioned. If they've been pushed from above to take the building faster, they'll push harder tonight." "Yes." "How much harder?" He looked at the floor. She watched his jaw. "Maximum effort on the 6th floor. They'll try to take it in a single sustained advance. They'll commit fully, pull from their reserve positions to do it, which means the flanks will be thin but the center push will be overwhelming." She took this in. If they commit to the 6th floor, what does that do to the 7th? If they take 6, they'll own the approach to 7. 7 falls in hours. And if they don't take 6, the ghost of something moved across his face. Then they'll have spent their reserve for nothing, and they'll need to wait for reinforcement from outside the city perimeter. Which takes time. How long? 18 hours, minimum. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze steadily, and she could see, underneath the steadiness, the thing she'd been seeing for 3 days and not yet named, the weight of something carried, the lean of someone bearing a load that didn't show. She was not ready to name it yet. "Then we hold the 6th floor tonight," she said. "I need your read on defensive positions." "Yes, Sergeant." She moved on. She always moved on. But she was building a model, and the model was becoming very clear. The 6th floor had been a surgical recovery ward. Yuna had moved the patients up 2 days ago when the 5th became contested. Omalade supervising the transport with a calm intensity that was her baseline now. The critical cases moved first, the less critical following, the ones who could walk walking, the ones who couldn't walk being carried by soldiers who were themselves exhausted in a bone-deep way that didn't show until you watched them on the stairs. The 6th floor was empty of civilians now and full only of soldiers and the ghost geometry of medical care. The bed still in place, the monitoring equipment dark, the 4 stands standing like thin silver sentinels in the auxiliary lighting. Yuna put Delacroix at the main corridor junction with Faro and Private Mays. She put Chen and Isaacs at the secondary approach. She put Lek and Voss at the stairwell with orders to hold the position until she told them otherwise, and she checked Lek's face when she gave the order, and he gave her a steady look back, and she believed he had it, today, whatever had been fracturing in him temporarily shored up by the simple presence of a task. She kept or with her. She put Reyes in the corridor behind the main junction so he'd have cover to work from, which he always needed, which he never complained about needing. Private Sione Atu positioned himself without being asked at the western window, a big man from the outer settlements, quiet in a way that was different from Orr's quiet, less internal and more deliberate, and he had a long-range optical attachment on his rifle that he'd kept functional through 19 days of siege through a combination of skill and obsessive maintenance. He'd made 11 confirmed long-range shots through the hospital windows, and the Dreth had started working around his sight lines 3 days in, which was a kind of tactical acknowledgement that Yuna thought he appreciated. Private Illis Nkwocha had set explosives. Nkwocha was the unit's demolition specialist, a 29-year-old with grease-stained hands and the slightly distracted air of someone whose brain was always running calculations. She had been creative with limited material for 19 days, shaped charges from scavenged equipment, delayed fuses from medical timers, 2 genuine emergency demolition packs that she had husbanded with religious care and had not yet deployed. She'd spent 2 hours on the 6th floor before the assault creating what she called a discouragement system, which was not a technical term but which Yuna had chosen not to correct. They waited, or said, 20 minutes. He said it without preamble, standing beside her at the junction between the main corridor and the recovery ward's central space. He said it the way he always gave these readings now, no explanation of method, no hedging, just the information, dropped like a stone. Yuna didn't ask how he knew. She said, everybody set, over the short range, and she heard the acknowledgments come back. It was 19 minutes. The Dreth came in force. She heard them before she saw them, the distinctive 3-beat percussion of their breaching charges on the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor, and then light, terrible and focused, and then they were in the corridor. She counted fast, 9, 12, 15, more than they'd committed to any single floor assault in the siege, and there were others coming. She could hear the secondary breaching on the west axis, Atu opening up with his rifle on that approach immediately, the crack-crack-crack of precise shots. She keyed the short range. Nkwocha, first package. The corridor junction 15 meters ahead disappeared in a contained explosion that threw 3 Dreth soldiers sideways and turned the approach into an obstacle field. Not lethal to all of them, she could hear movement in the smoke, but it broke the momentum, which was the point. The next 40 minutes were what Yuna privately thought of as the arithmetic of violence. Each decision reduced the variables by some number and increased them by others. Delacroix and Farrow held the main corridor in a 2-position crossfire that worked exactly as long as the smoke held visibility down, and then the Dreth found the gap and Maze took a hit. She heard him on the short range, controlled, I'm up, I'm functional, and she moved or to his position and pulled Maze back to Reyes. Maze had taken a pulse burn across his shoulder that had gone deep. Reyes looked at it with his precise, dark eyes, and his expression said what his mouth didn't. Keep him mobile, Yuna said. He'll be mobile, Reyes said, in the voice that meant I can make that promise for now. The secondary approach. Atu held the west window for 22 minutes before they pushed a unit around his sight line and forced him back. He moved without panic, repositioned, opened up from a new angle, and she heard the drop in the secondary assault that meant he'd hit something important. The stairwell. Lek held it. She had not been certain he would. She had made the call and placed him there, and she had not been certain, and she did not let herself think about the uncertainty until later when she had the space for it. He held it with Voss for 31 minutes against sustained pressure, which was 11 minutes longer than the position should have held by any calculation she could construct, and afterwards she didn't ask him how and he didn't tell her, and Voss just said, Lek was there, in a way that contained everything. An hour and 40 minutes after the assault began, the Dreth withdrew. Yuna stood in the smoke-filled corridor and counted. She counted 3 times because the first 2 counts gave her different answers and she needed to be sure. 27 soldiers standing, not counting Maze who was sitting with his back to the wall and technically ambulatory if you used the term loosely. Nkwocha had a long burn across her right hand, her dominant hand, and was already rearranging her grip pattern on the remaining demolition materials with the pragmatism of someone who didn't allow physical damage to alter the operational reality. Chen had a cut above his eye from debris that had bled dramatically but was, by Reyes's verdict, cosmetically offensive rather than dangerous. 612 civilians on floors 7, 8, and 9. 6th floor, held. They'll regroup for the next push, Or said beside her. How long? Longer than last time. They spent the reserve. He looked at the floor. 18 hours. She looked at him. He was looking at the floor. Go sleep, she said. Sergeant. Or sleep. That's an order. He went. She watched him go, and she stood in the destroyed corridor with smoke drifting through the auxiliary lighting and the fires outside painting long orange stripes through the blown windows, and she let herself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't command. That was just exhaustion and relief and grief. For Andreda's, for Jew, for Maze's shoulder, for Lex 11 extra minutes, for the children on the 8th floor sleeping in a hospital that had no business still standing. 30 seconds. She gave herself exactly 30. Then she called Delacroix. 7th floor, she said. Tell me what we have to work with. The 7th floor fell on day 17. Not in a single assault. It fell the way all the floors fell, incrementally, the eastern section first, then the corridor junction under sustained pressure, then the main ward, each section becoming untenable not in a moment of catastrophic failure but in a slow grinding sequence of decisions that added up to the same result. Yuna had gotten everyone out. That was the only metric that mattered when a floor fell. She had gotten all 26 mobile soldiers out, and she had not left anyone who couldn't be moved, and the civilians remained on 8 and 9, and they held the evacuation corridor to 8, and that had to be enough. She lost Private Ansel Devorian in the 7th floor withdrawal. Devorian was 27. He had been a civil engineer before the war, a fact that he found both ironic and useful in a siege. He was the one who identified load-bearing walls, who could read a building's structure by the sound of stress fractures, who had kept them from barricading a corridor that would have compromised the hospital's structural integrity on day 9. He had a habit of sketching floor plans obsessively, always updating them, always annotating them with tactical notes in his precise engineer's handwriting. He had drawn every floor of the hospital from memory on the 2nd day, and the drawings were still in Yuna's jacket pocket, folded to the shape of a wallet. He was covering the withdrawal when a Dreth pulse round found him through a window he hadn't known was clear. It was fast. Reyes got to him in 90 seconds. There was nothing to be done. She carried him out anyway. She was not going to leave anyone on a floor the Dreth held. She carried him out herself, with Delacroix taking the weight on the other side, and she put him in the storage room on the 8th floor that had become the place they put the ones they'd lost, and she took his floor plans out of her pocket and put them in his hands because she couldn't think of anything else to do and because they were his. Afterward she stood in the 8th floor corridor and let Delacroix see her face for 3 seconds before she made it right again, and Delacroix looked at her with the eyes of someone who had understood the mathematics of this war from the beginning, who had never pretended the losses were anything but what they were, and he said nothing, which was exactly what she needed. Or, she called. He was there in the corridor. He was always there, or always nearby, and she had stopped wondering if he slept at all. He looked at Devorian's storage room door with something that wasn't expressible as military bearing, something private and complete, and then he looked at her. "What do we have left to work with?" she asked. 8 and 9, he said. "The roof access. And time. How much time?" He tilted his head. The slight, involuntary gesture. "More than yesterday. They've pulled elements from the city perimeter to reinforce the assault force. That means less pressure from outside but more from inside. But pulling from the perimeter also means they've communicated something upward, a request, a timeline. They're asking for more time. Or they're being told they don't have it." Yuna considered this. If they don't have time, and we hold the 8th long enough, then whatever external pressure is driving the timeline becomes the deciding factor. He met her eyes. "We just have to hold." She nodded. She had been just holding for 19 days. She could keep doing it. She was made, at this point, almost entirely out of the capacity to keep doing it. "Show me the 8th floor choke points," she said. "All of them. Everything Devorian would have marked." He pulled out his own hand-drawn map. She hadn't known he'd been keeping one, and he unfolded it on the corridor floor, and they crouched over it together in the orange-tinged auxiliary light, and she thought, "He has drawn this from memory, accurately, in Devorian style, all the load-bearing walls and all the sight lines and all the positions." She thought, "He is always 3 steps ahead of me, and I do not yet know the full shape of how." "Here," he said, pointing. "The main corridor junction on 8 has a natural crossfire position if you station someone at the supply room door. The supply room has a window. It's small but ATU can use it. And here." She pointed to the north section. Nquocha should preset on this wall. If they breach the junction, we blow the wall and collapse the corridor section. It doesn't stop them, but it costs them 20 minutes and we can redeploy. Destroying a section of the hospital. A non-structural section. The building stays up. She looked at him. He held her gaze. She thought, Devorian would have checked that. Devorian is dead. She looked at his drawing, the load-bearing annotations in his careful script, and she thought, he knows how to read a building. She thought, he has been reading everything. All right, she said. Let's set it up. Day 19 became night 19 the way all the days had become their nights. Not a transition but a continuation, the light changing outside and the fires shifting their color and the assault rhythms changing in the minor way that distinguished Dreth Day tactics from Dreth Night tactics, which was mostly a matter of light sensitivity and the use of different targeting systems. Yuna had 23 soldiers. She had lost Devorian. She had lost Private Remus C on day 18, a Dreth blade in the maintenance corridor on the 8th floor, a C who had been 31 and who had a photograph of a dog in her chest pocket, an actual dog, a large brown animal whose name Yuna had never learned. She had lost Specialist Thomas Brecht on the afternoon of day 19, a pulse round, faster than Devorian, so fast that there was nothing to mark the absence except the absence. One moment Brecht was at a position and the next he was not, and Reyes's expression when he got there said the same thing his expression always said in those moments, and Yuna put Brecht in the storage room next to Devorian and a C and the others, and she walked back to her command position and she kept going. 23 soldiers. 612 civilians. 8 floors held, 7th lost, the Dreth controlling everything below. 5 floors of hospital they owned now, the medical equipment on those floors presumably already being catalogued and prepared for extraction. She didn't think about the lower floors. She thought only about 8 and 9. Reyes found her at 0200. I need to tell you something, he said. He had the flat effect of someone who had rehearsed how to say a thing. Tell me. Maze isn't going to hold much longer. The shoulder burn went into the joint complex. I've kept it managed, but without proper surgical intervention, he stopped. He's got 2, maybe 3 days of effective function before the pain management becomes impossible with what I have and the joint deteriorates to the point where he can't use the arm. Does Maze know? Yes. What did he say? He said he's got at least 2 more days, and that's what matters. Reyes paused. He's right, technically. How are you? He looked at her with those very direct eyes. I'm a medic in a siege, Sergeant. I'm exactly as fine as that sounds. Reyes. I'm functional. I'm going to keep being functional. He squared his jaw. I have people who need me to be functional. She nodded. He left. She stood at the 8th floor window and watched the fires below and thought about what it meant to be functional and how long you could sustain the definition before it needed renegotiating. At 0330, or came to her. He sat down against the wall beside where she was standing, sat down, which was unusual. She almost always found him standing at positions or crouching over things, rarely just sitting, and he put his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees, and he said, They're going to push tonight. The full remaining force. Everything they have. She slid down the wall and sat beside him. The corridor was quiet, both of them on the short range. She'd hear anything she needed to hear. How long? An hour. 90 minutes at the outside. She looked at the ceiling. The auxiliary lighting flickered every 3 minutes with a slight dimming that suggested the power cells were entering their final cycling stage. She had stopped trying to calculate how many cycles remained. If we hold 8, then they have nothing left to push with. Not in the building. The external reinforcement is 18 hours away, which I told you, and... He stopped. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the ceiling. His jaw was set. The expression on his face was the one she'd been watching for 6 days, the weight of something carried, now not quite contained. Or, she said quietly, Sergeant, is there something you want to tell me? A long silence. She waited. She was very good at waiting. No, he said finally. Not tonight. She studied his profile. The ridge at his temple that caught the flickering light. The secondary pupil contraction that she'd learned to notice. His hands on the rifle, still easy. After this, she said, when there's time. He turned his head and looked at her. Yes, he said. After. She pushed herself up from the floor. 1 hour, she said. I need everyone set. Yes, Sergeant. She moved. The push began at 0412. It was different from everything before. The Dreth committed in a way they hadn't committed since day one, all the constraint and measured tactical advance abandoned in favor of mass and momentum. They hit 3 access points simultaneously: the main stairwell, the maintenance corridor, and the emergency shaft that Nkocha had preset 2 days ago and now triggered at Yuna's command with a shaped charge that collapsed a 10-meter section of approach corridor and bought them the 20 minutes that were everything. In those 20 minutes, ATU shot through the north window at ranges he should not have been able to make at 0400 in the dark with the optics he had, and he made them 5 for 5, which opened a gap in the stairwell advance that Delacroix and Faro poured through with covering fire that pushed the Dreth back to the landing. Nkocha, with her rearranged grip and her burned hand and her final demolition pack, set the last charge on the maintenance corridor junction and triggered it from a position that should not have been tenable and was not tenable for about 30 seconds, and she moved in 28. Chen and Isaacs held the secondary access in a position that was an explicit trade. They gave ground, step by step, a controlled retreat that kept the Dreth from flanking the main position at the cost of the eastern section of the corridor, which they gave up and which the Dreth took, and which had been Yuna's calculation, because the eastern section was the section that could be given. Lek held the stairwell again. She didn't know how. She would not know how until later, until after, when Voss told her that Lek had simply not moved, that the Dreth had pushed and Lek had shot, and when the rifle ran empty he had reloaded and shot again, and that at no point had Lek's hand shaken, which Reyes had noted, quietly, with a kind of attention that was also a kind of tenderness. All was with her, and all was everywhere. He was with her when the main corridor junction almost broke, when the Dreth pushed 3 through a gap that Faro couldn't close in time, 3 inside the line, which was the moment that turned fights, and he was already moving before she gave the order, already in the gap. And what happened in the gap was fast, and not tactical, and she was moving herself, and the 3 Dreth were down, and or had a cut across his side from a blade that had found the gap between his armor plates, which he did not mention, and she saw it only because Reyes was 6 meters behind them, and Reyes saw everything. Or, she said. I'm functional, he said, in Reyes's exact tone. The push broke at 0551. She didn't believe it at first. She had learned in 19 days of siege not to believe that a withdrawal meant anything. The Dreth could be regrouping, could be drawing back to try a different access, could be cycling a rotation. She held everyone in position for 8 minutes, listening to the short range, watching the corridor monitors that Faro had kept operational through everything, watching. Nothing, she said. Faro. Anything on the antenna. Faro was across the corridor, her burned arm in a field sling that Reyes had constructed from medical materials, her equipment still running. Sergeant, there's something. Her voice changed. Sergeant, I'm getting a fleet carrier signature. Plural. 2, 3. I'm counting 4 fleet carrier signatures above the orbital plane. Yuna stood very still. They're broadcasting in the clear, Faro said, and her voice was doing something now, wavering at the edges. It's a human fleet. They've broken through the blockade. She stopped. They're calling for all surviving ground units. They're asking for position broadcasts. They're coming. The corridor was silent for 3 seconds. Then Lek made a sound that was not a word and was everything, and Faro was crying, silently and without stopping her equipment operation because she was a professional and she would cry and work simultaneously, and Delacroix leaned against the wall and put his head back and closed his eyes, and his face did something complicated and private that Yuna looked away from because it was his. She heard ATU from the north window. I can see them. Ships. I can see ships in the sky. She turned to Orr. He was standing in the corridor, watching her. The cut across his side was bleeding slowly, not catastrophically, but consistently. He had his hand pressed to it with the deliberate calm of someone performing damage management. His pale eyes were on her face. A human fleet, she said. Yes, he said. You said 18 hours for Dreth reinforcement. Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. She did not say what she was thinking. Reyes, she called. Or needs looking at. I see that, Reyes said, already moving. She turned toward the window. The sky was showing the first gray suggestion of dawn, and in that gray, moving against the stars, the shapes of ships, real ships, human ships, the specific silhouette of fleet carriers that she had not allowed herself to hope for in 19 days because hope was expensive and she had been running on a very tight budget. Behind her, she heard Reyes say, "This needs more than field stitching," and or say something low in response, and she heard in the texture of Orr's voice the thing she had been watching build for 6 days. The weight of it. The lean of it. She turned. Orr was on the floor. He had gone down fast. She hadn't seen it, and Reyes was beside him, and the hand that had been pressed to the cut was not doing enough because the cut was doing more than it had seemed. The plasma edge of the Dreth blade had done damage along the entry that hadn't been immediately visible, and now it was. Oh. She was beside him in 3 steps. He stopped. His jaw was tight. "It's manageable." "You're on the floor," she said. "Tactical repositioning," he said, and she heard in it the ghost of something like humor, and she put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Reyes." "On it," Reyes said. He was already on it. He was always already on it. "He needs the surgical bay. 8 has a working unit." "Then let's get him to it," she said. They carried him to the surgical bay on the 8th floor as the sun was coming up. Not carried. He could walk, mostly, with Delacroix's shoulder as a brace, and he maintained his own weight for most of it with the specific stubbornness of someone who has decided that being carried is a line they will not cross, which Yuna respected even now. Reyes had a field clamp on the wound and was muttering calculations under his breath. She recognized the tone, the medic calculating tone that meant he had a plan and the plan was executable. Dr. Omalade was already at the surgical bay. She had been awake since the push began, and she had the look of someone operating at the intersection of exhaustion and purpose, which was a look Yuna recognized because she saw it in every mirror she'd encountered for 19 days. "Put him on the table," Omalade said. "Reyes, walk me through it." They talked over Orr's body in the specific medical shorthand that excluded everyone else, and Yuna stepped back and let them work, and she went to the window. The sky was fully light now. The fires in the city below were mostly burned down to their last stages, not extinguished, but no longer being fed, and above the city, moving with the purposeful geometry of military approach, the fleet. She could see the landing craft beginning to descend from the carriers, long arcing trajectories, the specific angle of a hot entry that meant they were coming in fast and armed and ready. She could see them and she knew what they meant: logistics, reinforcement, evacuation, medical resupply, power generation, the slow and painful reassembly of all the things that a siege stripped away, and she stood there looking at them and she felt something that was not quite any feeling she had a name for. It was too large for relief and too exhausted for joy and too complicated for triumph. It was just, they were still here. 23 soldiers and 612 civilians and a hospital that the Dreth wanted intact, and it was still intact, and its people were still in it. She heard Omalade say, "He's stable," and she let herself exhale. She sat in a chair beside the surgical bay door and she waited while Reyes and Omalade finished, and while the fleet descended through the morning sky, and while the first landing craft made contact with the hospital's rooftop pad. She heard it, felt it through the building's bones, the specific impact of a landing strut on a surface that had been holding 600 lives for 19 days. And she waited until Orr was moved from the surgical table to a bed and Reyes had stepped out, and she said, "Reyes." He looked at her. "He'll be fine. The blade nicked something it shouldn't have, but nothing that can't be repaired properly. He'll need surgery at a proper facility, but he's stable and he'll make a full recovery." "Good," she said. "Go get help to the other wounded. Go get Maze." Reyes went. She went into the room. Orr was in the hospital bed. The irony was not lost on her. The soldier who'd spent 19 days defending the hospital now a patient in it. And he was pale and the secondary pupil contraction in his eyes was maximized, which happened in stress response as well as bright light, and he looked at her when she came in, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and was close to the point of setting it down. She pulled a chair beside the bed, and she sat in it, and she looked at him, and she waited, and that was all. He breathed. Outside, she could hear the fleet ships making landing, could hear the sounds of soldiers and the beginning of the logistics of rescue. She could hear, faintly, from the main ward, the sound of a child's voice, high and clear and surprised at something, some ordinary thing, something that was not a siege. "Sergeant," Orr said. "Oh, I need to tell you something." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know what I'm going to say." "I have a model," she said. "Tell me if my model is right." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a landing craft crossed the sky. The Dreth jamming signal, he said. It carries their command communications as a layered structure beneath the interference frequency. I don't think they know it's readable, they encrypt by assumption, because full humans can't parse the tonal architecture. He stopped. I can. Because of your mother, she said. Not a question. Because of my mother. He looked at the ceiling. I've been hearing it since day 2. Position data. Rotation schedules. Advanced timing. I understood it completely. He paused. I used it. Every day. I used it and I didn't tell you the source because you were afraid of what I'd think, she said. He looked at her. Yes. She was quiet. He said, every tactical read I gave you, every advance I flagged, every choke point I identified, every rotation I called out, every approach vector, it was the signal. Not instinct. The signal. I don't have extraordinary intuition. I have extraordinary access to their communications, and I gave you the intelligence and I called it something else because I didn't know how to tell you what it actually was without making you wonder. He stopped. He put his arm over his eyes in a gesture that was almost childlike. That was the gesture of someone who can't watch a thing happen to them. Or, she said. He kept his arm over his eyes. He was breathing. She said, how many days of intelligence did we get from you? He moved his arm. Looked at her. 19, he said. She nodded. She looked out the window. The fleet was coming down through the morning sky, carrier after carrier, the geometry of rescue made real and visible and undeniable. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Andredas and his photographs. She thought about Jew and his bad singing. She thought about Devorian's floor plans folded in the hands of someone who would not need them anymore. She thought about Lek on the stairwell and the 11 extra minutes she didn't have an explanation for. She thought about Omalade's hands. She thought about Reyes's eyes, the way he looked at people directly, not as challenge but as attention. She thought about, or at the end of the East Corridor on day 1, sitting still, head tilted, listening to something no one else could hear. She thought, 19 days. She thought, 612. She thought, 23. She looked back at him. Good, she said. She said nothing else. She sat with him in the morning light while the fleet came down and the city below began the long process of ending, and he breathed, and she breathed, and outside a child was talking in a high, clear voice about something ordinary, something that had nothing to do with the siege, something that was only possible because the siege was over and they were alive and they had held it, all of it, right down to the last night, the last push, the last 20 minutes of a war that was 19 days long and full of names she would carry forward for the rest of her life. She looked out the window. She said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. The hospital at Varek was fully evacuated by 1400 hours on day 20. All 612 civilians were transported off-world within 72 hours. Private or received surgical care aboard the fleet carrier Meridian and was medically cleared for duty 14 weeks later. He returned to the unit. Master Sergeant Yuna submitted his intelligence contribution for formal recognition in her after-action report. She described it as follows: private or demonstrated exceptional linguistic and intelligence analysis capability under sustained combat conditions, providing actionable tactical intelligence throughout the 19-day siege that was essential to the survival of both military personnel and civilian population. His judgment in the application of this capability was sound. His conduct throughout was exemplary. She did not specify the method. She was asked about this later. She said it was sufficient.